All right, well, we'll get started. It was a great morning, and now we're going to turn to our state's panel and our great panel of state policymakers, state regulators, and advisors, and talk about what this roadmap and the work on decarbonization looks like from a state policymaker perspective. I will start by just introducing all of our panelists right at the beginning. And then we'll, as the previous panels, we'll just have them speak in the order that they appear in the program. And I think it worked well to hold questions. So we'll do that again, and we'll leave ample time again for all of you to ask your questions. So very pleased that we have Nancy Lange, Chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, with us. In addition to chairing the PUC in Minnesota, she is also the current chair of the Energy Resources and Environment Committee at NARUC. But she's also been a partner with all of us here at the Great Plains Institute, many of you here in the room for years and years and years, going back to her days long before she joined the commission. So it's great to have you, Nancy. Ted Thomas chairs the Arkansas Public Service Commission. In addition, he is also the current president of the Organization of MISO States. Also very active in a number of regional energy policy and technology initiatives, and we value his contributions there. And I'll just say, in a previous life, he was not only a state legislator, but also a paid political consultant. So maybe he'll share some of, in addition to his policymaking perspective, some political insights for us. And then we have Commissioner John Rosales with the Illinois Commerce Commission. In addition to serving on the Illinois Commerce Commission, he also is a member of the NARUC Board of Directors, and serves currently as president of OPSI, which is the organization of PJM states. So we have the presidents of both of our regional transmission organizations in this region. And before becoming a commissioner, he was a vice president at Coca-Cola Bottling. Oh, and I already messed up. I had promised our friend and colleague Doug Scott, who is a former member of the Illinois Commerce Commission, now at the Great Plains Institute, I was to have a bottle of Diet Mountain Dew there ready for John. And I'm sorry I missed the prop. And then finally, Miles Keogh, who is the executive director of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, often referred to as NACA. And been in that job, I think, just about a half a year now. Is that right? And then before that, many of you knew Miles, his work at NARUC as a staff person to NARUC. And then prior to that, he, among other things, worked on the Massachusetts Public Utilities Commission. So thanks for making the trek out, Miles, from Washington. So great panel. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Nancy Lange.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. The collaborative work that's underway is encouraging. You can't hear me, huh? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, I thought you were wanting me to do something with that mic.
Oh, okay. The collaborative work that's underway here is encouraging because we've all seen the waxing and waning of federal policy. Ted and I first got to know each other through the Mid-Continent States energy and environmental regulators who got together to figure out the Clean Power Plan and how we might work regionally. And we spent a couple good years knocking our heads against the draft rule and the final rule and thinking about how states that were not suing the EPA and how states that were suing the EPA might find common ground if in the end we did have to comply with the rule. So the fact that this collaborative keeps going, in spite of, as I said, the tides turning and shifting and changing at the federal level, is encouraging to me. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about Minnesota. And I really appreciated Judy's remarks this morning where she talked about the circles of the drivers that are really behind many decarbonization efforts. She talked about technology, policy, markets, and behavior. And really the story in Minnesota for many, many years is one, I would say, where the predominant driver was policy. Minnesota was an early leader in energy efficiency. We've had an aggressive renewable portfolio standard since 2007. We have GHG state goals, economy-wide state goals. We have a law that requires externalities in all resource decisions that come before the Minnesota Commission, which we recently updated those externalities, and they're based in part on the social cost of carbon framework. We have a really robust integrated resource planning process in Minnesota, where we've made some really leading decisions over the years. The first 400 megawatts of wind was statutorily directed in Minnesota in the, I think, mid-90s or so. But the second 425 megawatts of wind came through the IRP process. And there have been many, I would say, leading decisions around decarbonization that have occurred in an integrated resource planning process in Minnesota. And we've just instituted distribution system planning requirements in Minnesota to try to understand better the scope of capabilities of the distribution system, the kinds of investments that are going to be made, and the kinds of resources that are going to come to play in the distribution system. Earlier today, we heard about some of those flexible, time-responsive, location-responsive resources, and distribution system planning is one piece that's going to help us understand those better. But I would say today and moving forward, at least into the near future, the carbon outcomes that I see occurring in Minnesota are driven by some of those other circles, maybe less by policy, more by what I wrote was economics, preferences, and technologies. So I had the technologies circle that Judy had. Maybe the preferences would be the behavior piece, and then the economics, the markets piece. We see, obviously, we've heard this morning the costs and performances of renewables really changing very rapidly, and that's sending a signal to our utilities and to others that renewables are the resource that makes sense to acquire for the environment and makes sense to acquire for customers. We talked this morning about, a little bit through the Q&A, about what does that mean to advance penetration levels in an integrated system like MISO, where you have the opportunity to take advantage of many, many diverse resources to balance the system, but you also have to have, of course, the transmission system to interconnect and to get those resources to the loads where they need to be. One of the most interesting things that I think as a commissioner is emerging is the preferences of consumers or customers, utility customers. Our utilities are telling us that with increasing frequency, their customers want renewable energy. They want new load to be served by renewable energy. And for a regulatory commission that kind of operates under all for one and one for all, and the costs are shared, and it's a public interest, starting to design what you might call boutique energy programs for some customers is a new challenge, but I think it's a challenge that regulators should rise to, because from my perspective, keeping customers satisfied, keeping customers integrated and on the grid should be a high priority for every commission. When you start to have large customer groups split off, think community choice aggregation in California, not that that's a bad policy, but it can have tremendous effects on the utility system. So I think as regulators, paying attention to what customers' preferences are and how we can do that in a way that's fair to all the customers, that's a challenge for us, and I think it's important. And then on the technology side, think of the change that's just happened since I've been on the commission. When I first got on the commission, the issue of data was, well, we kind of talked about, should utilities collect Social Security numbers and how might they keep those safe? And David Boyd, who was on the commission with me, you remember some of those kind of almost rudimentary data questions. And now commissions are starting and should be really thinking about what data should be collected, how should that data be analyzed, who should have access to that data, and how should we utilize it to make the system more efficient. Electrification, the opportunities that exist for electrification are compelling. Should all ratepayers be funding electrification programs? Should customers be paying for charging infrastructure? If it shifts costs across the system and helps, helps reduce costs by building load and making more kilowatt hours available to spread the cost, is that a good thing? So electrification is raising a lot of interesting questions for commissions, I think. And then the whole concept of virtual power plants. We talk about that in theory, and I think we're starting to see it in practice happen in places like New York and California, where they're starting to offset major generating resources with collections of resources, particularly demand-side resources. So in closing, I would just say I think regulators have some really interesting opportunities ahead of them to address some of these new drivers. And from my perspective, how might we address them? Well, in Minnesota, I think certainly relying on our integrated resource planning process continues to make a lot of sense. It's a robust, open, transparent process that serves our state well. I think the challenge for integrated resource planning, though, is how do you start to model things like demand-side resources, resources that don't have a capacity factor that's constant or don't have a cost curve that we easily understand. So I think the challenges exist to figure out how to fit those very important resources into IRP, but I think they're important to do that. And I know some commissions are really wrestling, particularly I know California is wrestling with that. I think we as regulators need to evolve. I think we need to think about how our processes are encouraging innovation or stifling innovation. I know one of the things that we as the commission have tried to do in Minnesota is encourage pilot projects. And I know people have all kinds of opinions about whether pilot projects are good or bad or ineffective. But I think if commissions can learn quickly along with utilities and derive findings and make changes, that's a good thing. And so I think we as commissions need to figure out how we can do our work a little more quickly. Business model reforms. That's going to be a huge thing going forward, I think. And my kind of banter with Nick Martin from Excel, why would the utility invest in efficiency if they can invest in a capital project like a wind farm? That's on us to help figure that out. If we think efficiency is a resource that can play and should play, are we sending the same signals that we are to a utility that right now is incented to invest in capital projects? How do we think as commissions about third-party innovators? Most of us are in vertically integrated states. We're not accustomed to working with third parties. But third-party innovators are really going to bring some, I think, important attributes to utility customers and how we allow utilities to work with those third parties in ways that are fair and also don't add to costs but produce innovations. I think that's going to be an interesting space for vertically integrated states to work on. And of course, last but not least is cost containment. When you think about the billions of dollars that utilities are investing in just their distribution system, or renewables, or transmission, or potentially stranded assets if they're moving away from some fossil units and can make the case that it makes sense to accelerate depreciation. All these costs are things that the commissions, obviously have to weigh and continue to weigh. Increasing rates are not something that I think are sustainable. year after year. I admire the solution somehow Iowa has figured out to not have any rate increases, and there must be some magic sauce in that. I don't know if it's the tax credits or what, but I think for all commissions, we want innovation, we want improvements, we want decarbonization, and we need to do it as cost efficiently as possible. So I'll turn it over to Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. These kinds of conversations have been very valuable to me in my service as a commissioner in terms of learning the issues, hearing various perspectives. The report kind of takes an ideal from 2050. What I'd like to talk a little bit about is how do you get there from here. And to me, there's a continuum of cost on one side and carbon on the other side. Most reasonable people care about both. And where each state is in a different spot along that continuum. Of course, those moves, they move with the political winds. But negotiating that, to me, is the key to how this happens from a political point of view, because that's how we govern ourselves. And it's very difficult in that context to have a rational discussion of risk. And that's what a lot of this involves. And when you, if you can take folks on the right and the folks on the left, and you could switch what they say about what the folks on the right say about security and crime issues, and what the folks on the left say about public health issues, you can almost reverse those in terms of what role reason plays and what role fear plays. And so all this will happen in a political environment, but and when you look at my state, we're on the cost side of the continuum, no doubt. California is probably the opposite. But I was just talking with President Picker of the California Commission, and we kind of got to a very similar place on what we want. What we want is a network that is plug and play for new technologies, so that you get an apples to apples price comparison across different technologies. And we both get to that same spot. And it's not only getting to that spot, it's something that I can sell in Arkansas and he can sell in California. To me, there's a spot out there to do that, and it's different. You emphasize different things, but you try to get to the same spot. But the cost thing is real. I mean, you look at the gas tax debate in California right now. And when you throw that out there, it shifts the political dynamic. So all this stuff has to be managed through that. And there are, in my view, a number of very critical policy stuff that's contemporary that we're trying to do right now that will have a big impact on how this plays out. The first one is a capacity issue. How do you get paid for capacity? Because in utilities we have capacity and energy. I haven't heard anybody suggest a different way to do that. I've heard people nibble around the edges where it's still that. But we don't have a capacity market in MISO. So even though we've had demand response program like the FERC did, we don't have any in MISO, or very little. We have some, not a lot. We're not going to have it without a capacity market, or some way to get paid for capacity. Same for storage. You can have all the 841s you want. Nothing's going to happen if the only revenue you get from the wholesale market is in energy. It's not going to happen. And that walks us in to the jurisdiction issues, which are sticky for state commissioners. There's two big jurisdiction issues out there right now. One is the PJM order that came out last week that might have nuked the stakeholder process, and it might have nuked the capacity market. We don't know how that will play out. But it's a very difficult issue. But you're not going to get DER, you're not going to get these things unless there's storage, unless there's a way to get paid for capacity. A second issue is the DER jurisdiction. So in MISO, what you have to do, if you want to pay people for grid services, things like ancillary services, it has to be at wholesale. And if you want to get paid capacity, it has to be at retail. So you got to mix the two together. That's really hard to do. It's hard to do in part because our national association's views on jurisdiction, which is guard your jurisdiction, with your life. But you have to mix it or it's not going to work. And it's interesting that these three folks are up here because I tried to push an initiative to come up with a settlement on these matters, and there were only like 3 in the whole world, right here, and right here, that wrote positive things. All the rest of the commissioners, well, not all of them, but most of them are in a different place. But if we're going to litigate about jurisdiction, it impairs the technology. And they have a bad strategy. The PJM order showed a division in the FERC, 3-2, on a state jurisdictional question. The NARUC position unites the FERC as 0-5 against it. To me, the right strategy was to try to take one of the sides and push it over and then move the ball on jurisdiction. But that didn't happen. The last time the states won a jurisdictional fight in court, I was wearing diapers. And if we go full circle, the next time they win one, I'll be on the end of the spectrum, if I make it that far, back in diapers. So that's my thought on jurisdiction. It's an important issue because it's a DER. When you look at the chart, here's the DER. It's not going to happen unless we figure out how folks can get paid at retail, state jurisdiction, and for ancillary services, RTO markets, federal jurisdiction. You got to mix the two, and staking a stake in the ground against Order 841 is not a good way to do it. Transmission issues, wind issues, are transmission issues. They're almost intractable. And we're going to have a meeting between OMS, which is the MISO regulators, and the RSC, which is the SPP regulators. And so I'm going around like I tend to do, banging on everybody, trying to see what shakes loose. It's almost intractable. That wind section on those graphs, we got to solve the transmission issues if we're going to make progress on that. So in Omaha, I think it's next Monday, we're going to try to get the regulators on the OMS side and the other to start talking about these. There's two, we call them seams issues. There's the little seams issues, which is just how do you manage the seam, what are projects that are benefit, how do you have processes that result in those projects. That's the little seams issue. The big seams issue is wind export. There's a LMP black hole in Guyman, Oklahoma, and that power comes out. That's a lot of that of the wind section on those graphs is trapped there. We've got to work on the transmission issues. Other issues, 841 and 1547. IEEE standard, everybody knows 841's on storage. To me, that's going to drive the technology, just not on storage, but on communication. And same with IEEE 1547, which talks about how an inverter, whether it's an inverter on a solar or storage facility, can communicate so that the RTO can see it. To me, that's a big part of the technology driver. It's not just the storage, it's seeing it so then you can get paid those benefits on the wholesale side if we ever work these jurisdiction issues out. And then IEEE is an engineering standard in terms of the components being able to communicate. And there's some issues there. They can communicate to the utility, then the utility to the RTO, have a distribution system operator. You know, how will all that work? But it will drive the technology when the RTO can see what's happening out there and dispatch it. That's the key to capturing some of the value. So those are all federal things. Of course, the things we want to do at the state level, you know, it interacts with the federal level. A few things that we're doing is the smart meters and data, as Chair Lange referenced. You got to have the grid. You need rational ways to make sure you're getting value out of the grid. If you're going to do all of this stuff, you got to have the grid that supports it. It's like the network. It's like the internet to e-commerce or electronic banking. And so with that becomes the data issues, the time of use issues, and the third-party issues. We're working through all of that. On the incentives that Chair Lange also referenced, we have an interesting program with respect to solar. Of course, a utility has to invest to get return. If they do a purchase power agreement, they don't get that. So we passed a statute that gives the commission the authority to give the utility what they call an additional sum on a PPA. And what we did with that is say, okay, you can do a project, and if you can beat the MISO price, you get 20% of it. That aligns the ratepayer interest with the shareholders. They're going to get the good price, they're going to use the right modeling, because if they don't and the price goes the wrong way, then they do all that and they don't get paid. If they get a good price, they get a cut with the, and we've had one project that's done. It's in the 90 megawatt to 100 megawatt area. There's a second one in the pipeline. They don't have a transmission issue. It's what they do in Arkansas. They just go down the transmission line and they find the cheapest property. Then they build it right under the transmission line. That gives us the investment in the poorest counties where we need it the most. So we like that policy, and we're going to try to complete the circle. What we want them to do is they get this solar facility. We want them to sell that, and this is what's not yet complete. We want them to sell that to people that want to do a subscription service like a green tariff. That way you're getting competition with the net metering thing. Where if somebody wants to buy a little bit of that, then price competition. It also helps with the evolving utility business model. They're not going to participate in a process that leads to their termination, right? Nobody does that. They have to be able to see ways for them to make money to evolve their business. And when you can find ways where it's price competition and the consumer is choosing that, you know, not us, you know, giving them sticking a feather in their hat and helping them along, you know, to me, that's the way to get them thinking, if there's an itch out there, how do I scratch it? If there's folks that want the solar, how do I participate in that so they can begin the process of evolving their business? Of course, efficiency, glad to see that as number one. Our efficiency program is among the leaders in our region and among the low-cost states. We recently bumped up the targets on that. Then wind, that's in the mix. We approved the wind catcher project recently. That's still up for consideration in Oklahoma and Texas, so it's not yet done. A few more thoughts. Then one thing on this for discussion on the EV thing, we discussed this notion of the sharing economy. There's an alternative notion that to me each EV is potentially a storage device and is a co-economics issue that in a lot of new technologies, that's where it gets started on price because there are co-benefits with another economic source. They don't currently build them to do that. But if one were to take all of those batteries, that's another way to get the capital efficiency that was referenced earlier. All of those batteries aggregated, participating in the wholesale market, if it doesn't degrade the battery or you know, interfere with what you're doing in transportation. That's a mutually exclusive, perhaps, model with the sharing, but it's targeted at the same thing. Although, I don't think the EV folks are thinking that way yet, because you don't have the option to put it back out. It's one way, kind of backwards, like our distribution system is. Finally, the hard part with all of this is, you know, you can get the theme right and the policy right, but at the end of the day, you have to put it in a tariff. The economics that you want have to be reflected in the tariff to change the behavior. And then the other side of that is reliability. The electrons have to flow. You can do all these wonderful things, but the engineers have to make the electrons flow. So there's kind of a, you know, where it's at from the big picture in terms of getting there. Some very important our federal policies that will impact state policies and a few of the things they're doing. Thank you for having me, and I will pass it to my colleague, Commissioner Rosales.
Thank you, Ted. I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I'll be honest and say this is one of the most prestigious panels that I've ever been on, and I'm in total seriousness. I look up to these folks so much, Nancy and Ted, and I will take exception with Miles when they said he was, you know, he was staffer at NARUC. We worked together at NRI, and you were more than a staffer, man. You know, the work that you did was just incredible. And I always, no, I really appreciated how you always wanted to move the needle, and I think that's why you're moving up so quickly in the industry. So, so I want to send a shout out to Milwaukee. I ran the Coca-Cola company in Chicago, and then when we were bought out by Coca-Cola Enterprises, I was promoted to vice president, and Milwaukee was one of my areas. Proud. Being from Mexican descent, we have a work ethic that reminds me when I'm in Milwaukee. If you look at all the clocks here, they all work. They all work. There's a pride that they have here in Wisconsin that that I admire. I really, really do. Because when I go back to Chicago, there's not one clock that works. And when you ask them about it, they say, what works twice a day, you know. Yeah, so it's just, they don't have that that pride like they do in Wisconsin. I got to be honest. So thank you for having me. I'm taking over from my chairman. He was taking over for him. I don't have any prepared remarks, but I will tell you some observations that I have being the senior commissioner in Illinois. I had a conversation with Northwestern University last week in which they interviewed me for an event, an article, and they said, think back to what was the best part about attending Northwestern University. And I said, getting free food for being on a basketball team was the first thing that came to my mind. And then I wanted to know the second thing. And really it was about, in fact, I didn't play. I was just trying out with Tex Winter at the time. God rest his soul, was a great coach. But I'll tell you the one thing I did learn, and what you really learn in college is how to think. And I think that that is something that has helped me in this position, and just like you're doing, how you're putting together your program for 2050, thinking about how you get to the next steps. And you can't get to 2050 without going through 2020, 2030, 2040. You really have to take it in steps. Looking at the long range, but understanding to get to long range, you have to work on a short range. And so I'm very proud of the work that we're doing in Illinois. You know, FIJA came around in 2016, and it was one of those times that I think, you know, changed, at least from Illinois, changed energy forever in terms of moving forward. Although it's a 10-year program, the fact that they had all the stakeholders together to have ideas of what to do with wind and solar and nuclear, and having incentives for zero emissions and getting credits for them, I think was a credit to the legislature and to the governor. Next grid that happens with us that we put together. I had can't remember where I spoke the last time, where I said one of the reasons that this was with you, Nancy, when I was running for president and lost. But when we were at Mark, and we talked about the reason it's hard to do those programs like Next Grid and Power Forward or whatever, and what they're doing in Minnesota, very few states do that because it takes a lot of work. And I'll tell you that not only does it take a lot of work, but when you think outside the lines, when you think about moving forward in energy in this country, be prepared to be sued. Everything that we've done, from FIJA to Next Grid, I've been sued so many times, more than my first wife, you know, and except for, you know, not having the sheriff come by and serve me, you know, it's whatever you do, it's somebody's not going to be happy, you know, and you try to get as many stakeholders as possible to get involved in the process. You really do, but yeah, I understand there's going to be winners and losers whenever you try to move outside the lines. Ted does MISO, I do PJM. Certainly, I picked the short straw, and have to tell you that as president, I truly enjoy working with my states. I have 14 members. Exactly half are vertically integrated, and the other half are competitive markets. So it's 7 and 6 in DC. So I enjoy that, but 7/8 of Illinois is MISO, and it's like a grandkid going to your grandparents' house when you go to MISO. You know, it's just so much fun. You know, you really enjoy it. You know, and then you go to PJM, and it's like when your mother tells you have to go by your uncle's house, and you really don't want to go. He's really cranky, and he knows everything, and you know, I just have to sigh. You know, and tell him, "Look, don't send that in to FERC. Please don't send that in to FERC. Please, we could work it out. Give us some more time. Don't send it into FERC." No, I got to go send it into FERC. And they send it into FERC. And, you know, and now not only are the 2 constructs that they sent into FERC were thrown back, the construct that they have right now with PJM was thrown back. So it's a constant battle that we find ourselves in. And being president of OPSI, it's really difficult. The one good part is, you know, we've been able to come as a group very close together. Most of everything that we've sent in terms of resolutions and letters to PJM have been unanimous, and that is very difficult to do. I don't recall ever in the history of OPSI when all states, both vertically integrated and through the ones that have competitive markets, have all agreed. But it becomes difficult. The new construct that we're working at now, the FRRs that the FERC has thrown out as perhaps an idea is something that we're trying to get, you know, our arms around. And as Ted had mentioned before, you know, it's going to play out a little bit with our customers. We kind of need to know where they stand and how they feel, because this is major in terms of which way we go. But I will tell you that whenever you get outside the lines, it becomes difficult. So I talked about FIJA and working on the zero emission credits and the ZECs and the RECs. We'll talk about the next grid. Again, you know, we're trying to think ahead, like Minnesota and Ohio and some of the other states have put together some programs. Are trying to understanding that you know, the infrastructure is old. You know, I get beat up. You know, when we put modernization in for the gas lines because it's costing too much, but yet again, you know, I was in a position where, you know, those lines are 100 years old. Now, why I should be in a position that the lines were 100 years old and why I didn't take care of them when it was 75 years old? You know, it's nothing I can't answer. But what I can answer is I want to make sure that we're safe, and that's really the underlying motto of what we do in Illinois. Miles.
Follow that guy with this panel of folks. This is very intimidating. I'm Miles Keogh. I'm the executive director of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. It seems like y'all can't get away from NARUC, but I, in fact, am not with NARUC anymore, even though I miss these guys a lot. NACA is the 156 air pollution control agencies in 35 states, 116 cities and counties, the District of Columbia, and 4 territories. And today, I am going to be speaking in the much less safe and much more, hopefully for you, enjoyable, maybe thought-provoking, but let's keep our expectations low, of speaking only with my personal comments, my opinion. So if y'all go live tweeting this, and this goes back that this was the official NACA line, not only will you be putting me in the homeless shelter, but the next guy won't be nearly as much fun to listen to. So we're talking about decarbonization by 2050. And when we do that, you know, I moved from being at NARUC, being a very likable dude, to now being a very roundly disliked dude. In Washington, D.C., what that means is I'm a political moderate. And so that basically makes me, like, people say moderate, and then they spit on the ground thereafter. It's a pretty tricky spot to be in. And so I hope to make you all dislike me by the end of this as well, too. Brad asked me to talk a little bit about what's going on outside the context of the Public Utility Commission world and what's going on outside, you know, on a kind of a more national level. Well, we used to have a movement towards a clean power plan, but I think it's fair to say right now that the movement towards decarbonization by 2050 is a state and local question. It's really not a federal question. We'll get into where that's going in just a sec. What that actually looks like in terms of explicit policy is RGGI's growing. There's now 9 states in it. My home state of Virginia has joined in with RGGI. And we've got California trading with the Canadians. And so, you know, on a North American basis, we got a couple subnational explicit markets for decarbonization going on. We've also got 20 states and 230 cities who are in Paris. Y'all all know what that means. I'm sure earlier speakers this morning when I was on the plane regaled you with the glories of what being in Paris is. Although I think in terms of what we see in terms of, you know, kind of benchmarks and then success profiles and then action plans to get from your benchmark profile to your target profile, like that's still a work in progress. Being in Paris is a lot easier to say than it is to do. And so we're seeing some movement there, but it's not the kind of movement that we had with the prescriptions that were laid out in the prospective Clean Power Plan. Let's talk a sec about the Clean Power Plan. Only 3 states, I looked at the map that's included in the document here, and when I was looking at that map, only 3 of the states that are included in that initiative did not sue the EPA over the Clean Power Plan. There's only 3 of them, Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. The rest of the folks who are participants in this sued the EPA over that. And it's been stopped. The courts and the Congress have made clear they're of the opinion that the federal agency exceeded what Congress had given it the mandate to do. The CPP revisions that are being looked at by the administration now, I don't have some sort of, you know, secret leaker hotline where I'm talking to, you know, some deep state operatives over there in the Ariel Rios building. But what's been reported broadly in the media and what my friends in the majority party tell me is that it'll look at inside the fence line improvements only. Well, there's something else that's going on, which is going to be pretty interesting, which is there is a, at the same time, effort to reform new source review. This is where things will get a little spicy. New source review is a difficult program to love, right? It's if you print out all the paperwork requirements, it's a big ass box that lands up on your desk, and it's a challenging program to love. So I'm not in either a personal or professional capacity coming to laud new source review. But if you're going to reform it without pollution prevention components built into it, baked into the DNA of it, then what you find is that the combination of an inside the fence line redo of the CPP without the pollution prevention collar of something, a better new source review or the existing ones, the CPP actually has several pathways into the future that could result in increased pollution. We got to comply with this pollution reduction thing, but it'll cause us to do inside the fence line improvements, and on an hourly basis or on a life of the plant basis, it pollutes more. And if you think that 27 states sued over the last CPP, the number is going to go up if these two things go up hand in hand. So I don't think we can put our eggs in the EPA is just going to fix the CPP basket right now. Right now, today, in fact, as we speak, there's a hearing on the Hill about those new source review reforms that could have those well-intentioned but unintentioned outcomes of pollution increases. In the House also, we had earlier this week a 237 to 163 vote in the House of Representatives that came from Steve Scalise that argued that a carbon tax is going to be harmful to Americans. So I'm going to suggest that we can't wait on Congress to provide a legislative driver towards, in this session, towards greenhouse gas reductions. And even if you're fired up about what's happening in the midterms, which, again, I'm a moderate, so I'm not fired up about any kind of transformational, I like slow incrementalism. But the president will have to sign legislation, and we're going to have this president until 2020 or 2024 or similar-minded folks out into the future. There's a ways to go. So legislation is not something that's going to be at a federal level the immediate driver. So let me pause for a sec. 2050. In 2050, that's 32 years from now. In 2050, I will be 77 years old. That is actually the life expectancy of a man in North America as of right now. So when we talk about what are we going to do by 2050, that is literally, I think about that in terms of the year I'm going to crap out and die, right? So this is, what are we going to do within my lifespan? If we, yeah? Remaining lifespan. After the speech, it's going to be a lot less than 32 years. I guarantee that. This speech is making me 32. 32 years ago was 1986. The U.S. economy, the GDP, was $4.13 trillion. Today, it's $18.18 trillion. That's an increase of 441% over 32 years, right? So when we talk about, I don't know if we can afford to do this. Well, can we do it with 441% more money? Maybe. Right, let's think about that. On the other hand, so we may have money, but what we definitely don't have is time. Because if you move the clock back from 32 years down to 28 years or down to 24 years, then you actually have to pass legislation. You got 20 years to do it. Any of y'all ever permitted a power plant? I permitted a crap ton of them up in Massachusetts. In 20 years, the last case that hit my desk when I was leaving the Massachusetts Commission was the interconnection for Cape Wind. Nice. You're picking up what I'm putting down. 20 years is not a lot of time when you have a legislative driver. We got to start thinking about, when we say it gets more expensive the longer you wait, who we're telling that to is the power companies, the regulators, the auto companies. You can push this off, but the longer we wait, it's not us who's going to carry it. It's not us clean air agencies. It's y'all. It's the people who are going to get yelled at about it. It's y'all. It's the people who are trying to figure out, how do I transform the power system, the fleet, in 20 years, which is the blink of an eye. 24 years. It's nothing. It's nothing. I think we have money. I don't think we have time. Let me talk about what's possible in 32 years or 28 years or something. I'm not sure. I think this problem is real. I wince when I see folks go up in front of Congress and they say, when pinned down by Sheldon Whitehouse or Tom Carper, is climate change real? And they say, well, there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change. Because they're right. There's a lot of uncertainty about climate change. Not whether it's happening. What order do we retire power plants? What kind of new power plants should we put in? What do we do about cars? How do we electrify them? How do we electrify them when California's waiver to set clean car standards is, quite possibly going to be revoked? When we talk about electrification, if there's no driver, there's going to be no electrification. There's going to be no cars. We have money. What we don't have is, we don't have time. I think these problems, there are conditions of uncertainty. What do we do that's the wisest course to prevent the worst possible outcomes? I think we can find some bipartisan agreement that we should be reducing the uncertainty about the wisest course to avoid the worst conceivable outcomes. I think this problem is really real. I think it's urgent. I think it's solvable, but I think we've got to start really rethinking, oh, we don't have the money to do this, but we have the time. I think we've got to start talking about, what can we do starting in 2020, starting in 2024, et cetera, to start solving this real urgent and solvable problem. Let me say one last thing, and then I'll turn things over to Brad, because I've been talking to it for 11 minutes, and I promised I'd only do 10. Come 2020 or 2024, there will be some more thinking about, I genuinely believe our political discourse will come back to this thing about, how do we actually resolve what there is uncertainty about the wisest course forward. All of these folks, and David Boyd, Michael Krauthammer, who, by the way, I noticed you've joined my organization and you've got a bright future with us. How do we maintain some of the institutional infrastructure that enabled us to make wise choices about decarbonizing the power fleet when we were thinking about this in terms of the Clean Power Plan? I'm not an advocate of the Clean Power Plan. It was a ship that hit a reef, And I'm not saying that we just need to put it back into place. There's legitimate disagreement about whether the agency had the authority that it took. So I'm not pushing that, but I am saying that the institutional infrastructure that was built in states to try and figure out the wisest course forward was tremendously useful. And I think we're going to lose it. I think in the clean air agencies, we're so busy worrying about rollbacks of standards on air toxics, on permitting, on an absence of enforcement, on cuts to programs, on criteria pollutants, on, what do we do about the California waiver? That's where all the air is going. And at EPA and at the state agencies as well, and the local agencies as well, that institutional infrastructure is degrading. And come 2024, 2020, thereabouts, we're going to be like, all right, let's do this thing, and we're going to be back at ground zero for the institutional infrastructure to accomplish it. And I wonder if folks in this room would just be mindful of that. I'm not sure I have a prescription for fixing it, but certainly it's something that we see today. And I'm going to take a really risky step here and just ask, can I get a show of hands for folks from the Wisconsin DNR today? We're in Wisconsin. The governor of Wisconsin prohibits Wisconsin from spending any money on this stuff. So, that's within the political rights and priorities of this state. But it does highlight that come 2020, 2024, if we're not careful, we're going to throw a party and no one's going to know the directions to the venue. And with that, I'm going to pass things back to Brad. It's been nice working with y'all, and by the way, if any of you are hiring.
Thank you, Miles, and the other panelists. So I'd like to open it up. We have about 20 minutes. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience.
The word is dumbfounded. Sorry, y'all.
So any questions? Surely someone's got a more interesting question than I do. Okay, well, I'll get it started. Franz and I were talking before the session, and thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective as a group in terms of having heard the discussion in the morning about the roadmap and the fact that you have, which is clearly unusual, a broad set of companies and environmental advocates and others supporting the effort, the enterprise together. How do you see the roadmap as a work product contributing to the work that you do as policymakers, whether it's in like an IRP process or however you approach these things on a commission or, Miles, in your case, at NACA? And whoever'd like to.
I can jump in. Just saw it this morning for the first time, so digesting it, but I took away some of the observations that we've heard. Interestingly, gas prices is like the big lever on the pump, and I didn't know what the gas price assumptions were in the modeling, but certainly at commissions we see that same thing in our planning, that gas prices can really move the needle. I think what's challenging is we are being asked, I think at all our commissions, except maybe Illinois, I don't know if you've got a gas plant in front of you for approval, or do you probably don't even approve generation at all, do you?
No.
No, okay. So I know Ted and I probably both will have proposals for gas plants in front of us, and the question of the climate risk and how we think about those decisions, at least I know in Minnesota, will be in that decision. And I have to be a little careful because it's live in front of us in September, and for don't want to reflect on that too much. But I think for all commissions, we're all being asked to make decisions about gas plant investments. And that risk about climate is something that I know will be ripe in the Minnesota case. And I don't know, Ted, you and I were kind of talking about that at the break. How do you think about, I know you've put a lot of stock in low gas prices and what it means for your consumers in Arkansas. But do you think about it from the other side? You talked about this continuum of carbon and cost. how do you think about it on the other side with the carbon question?
Can I get a gas price, or get a gas plant decision right if I can't turn on a microphone? Maybe not.
The gas companies.
To me, it's all about trying to manage the risk and have a no regrets strategy. So yeah, I like the low gas prices because you get carbon reduction, not as much as we need without price increases. That's good. But at the same time, if you put all your eggs in that basket, you're not going to like it. And I don't know what's going to happen with CPP2 or whatever. Here's what I do know, that we haven't stopped preparing for whatever it's going to be. We didn't hesitate through all the events, through the stay, through the passing of Scalia, through the election, to whatever they're trying to do now. We're going to be prepared. There's prepared and there's unprepared, and that's an easy choice. So we want is no regrets across the entire spectrum and a market process to phase in what comes next, and then also a market process to phase in next generation technology. And to me, the roadmap shows there's a way to get there. There's price uncertainty and there's technological uncertainty, but still there are reasonable scenarios when you get there. And to me, a big part of whatever we do needs to recognize the fact that the first innovation isn't the last innovation. Whatever policy you do, you need to be capable of phasing. I mean, remember when razor phones were cool? You had big cell phones, then you had razor. Well, for certain nerds accepted, then you had BlackBerry, and then you had Apple. And it's kind of stopped with Apple, where Apple became the network, and now the innovation branches off from the network. We need policy that brings the technology, but as it bounces, as one disruptor becomes disrupted, it needs to accommodate it. And to me, that's there's price risk. The price can go either way, but the technology is the ultimate answer to this question. And that's why we need market-based, technology-friendly, where you get the successive innovation.
Yeah, and I think, Ted, one of the things that maybe for the audience you were talking about that they maybe don't have complete understanding of is the FERC's investigation into aggregating DERs and
Yes.
and what the state and federal jurisdiction is there. And I know you've made a lot of reference to that, but the idea that you were proposing is that states ought to have the ability to make a choice about how their resources participate. And maybe you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yes.
Because I think it illustrates access to markets for technologies and the roles that states can play in making those decisions.
Yeah. When you don't have a capacity market, and capacity is among the largest revenue sources, it's no-go unless you're doing retail. If you want to capture the value that DER provides to the grid in terms of ancillary services, and you don't want to guess what that benefit is projected into the future, what you need is a real-time market in ancillary services. That's wholesale only. The two have got to work together. So the proposal was essentially, and it was also 841 friendly. I support 841. The jurisdictional basis of 841 is it is a sale for resale. It's right there in black and white in the Federal Power Act. FERC has jurisdiction over sale for resale, and if I charge my battery and I sell it at wholesale, that is a sale for resale. So the idea was that NARUC should punt that because it's a legal argument that you're going to lose anyway. If you punt it, then you avoid having to oppose 841, which I think is bad policy, bad everything. But the other side is, what it would do is it would recognize that there are double counting issues When you have state and federal mixed, you got to make sure everybody gets paid once and nobody gets paid twice. The idea is what states should make that decision. States also have the ultimate hammer on that because all they have to do is not offer a retail program. Nobody's going to play wholesale. What do your net metering advocates do? Tell them, oh, I got a great idea for you. We'll give you the RTO price. Well, they'll tell you you're against solar for saying that. You got to have the retail component. You got to have the wholesale component. We need to negotiate that out. This litigating for 5 years takes our eye off the ball. And what I do in life is I manage which pile of manure I don't want to shovel. And I try to manage against that. I don't want 5 years of jurisdictional fights when we have these complicated policy things that we should be focused on. I think NARUC missed an opportunity to do that. And 3 weeks later, when PJM, when that order blew up the thing and you saw the divisions in the FERC that we could have exploited to resolve that question, we missed the opportunity.
Great. So there is a question back here, but I don't know if John or Miles wants to add.
One other thing to throw into this, when I look at the stuff in the report, what's interesting to me is the two questions that I have is, and I belabored this point before, the steps that are described, the outcomes that are described in each of the scenarios, thinking through how in a constrained period of time, you know, like thinking back, like planning a wedding. All right, if we're getting married on 2050, then these plants have to be built by this date, which means the steps to get those plants built have to ease back to this date, et cetera. And when you look at 20, 24 years to reach some of those scenarios, then the question becomes, Kathy Williams raised 4 different drivers. One of those drivers has to step in, and the less time you try to meet those targets in, the more unlikable, strident, difficult, and vigorous that driver has to be. Policy is probably the one that upsets people the most, but is the one that has the most planning that goes into it, rather than markets, technology, which is no one even says technology without saying disruptive, or behavior, which controlling behavior or easing into behavior, that driver is probably the one that's the least pleasant to have behaving vigorously to force big changes in a short period of time. So that's really when I'm looking at it. Like, how long do we have, how powerful the driver, and which of those is going to hurt me the least?
Well, Joe Sullivan, I'm with the Center for Energy and Environment in Minneapolis.
Hang on just a sec, brother. Would you let Commissioner Rosales, I think he had
yeah,
something smart to say.
There's like a whole lot of subjects up here, from gas to DERs to policy. So I just want to point that out. Okay, go ahead. No, seriously.
I didn't mean to blow up your spot there.
No. I don't know which way to go, but I do see, if I had to combine all 3 of those, that's where the regionalism comes from, in a number of ways. We're very blessed in Illinois, especially with the gas lines. You know, they're abundant. They're throughout the state. We rarely, if any time, have I ever heard that there was any constraints. As you move toward the East Coast, and my state's under OPSI, that's a whole different story. Nancy mentioned about the vertically integrated. For MISO, they are vertically integrated states. But as I move through Illinois and move again east, then half of them are integrated and half are not. So then you start, when we start talking about policy, and I'm kind of grabbing this all together, this is where we have our discussions, because we're not all the same. We're not assimilated at all in how our states are governed. So we have some real challenges if we want to talk about a gas program, or where do we want to go in terms of especially resiliency. And I know we talked with PJM and Andy about the government had asked PJM about it, with 24% of the electric capacity in the country. You know, how does that going to affect them, and if gas is going to be involved? I mean, there's a number of questions that come up, but it's very regional in terms of what the answers would be. So go ahead and ask your question.
Joe Sullivan, again, with the Center for Energy and Environment in Minneapolis. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for, it's been a very interesting and thoughtful conversation. But when we're talking about policy, I think there's a, I think it's, the message is clear that we need additional policy drivers. I'm interested in your opinion as policymakers, and how would you advise advocates to push in a hyperpolarized political environment? How do we push for clean energy policies? And it's very easy to kind of jump onto a tagline, 100% renewables or whatever. Policy, great, it's a great name, but it doesn't really mean much, when it comes down to, the regulator. So what is your opinion? What is your advice to advocates for how they should engage in this hyper-polarized environment that we find ourselves in?
I'll take a crack and say what I found fascinating under the Federal Energy Jobs Act, the FEJA bill, was a number of stakeholders come together that really never came together before. I mean, the Sierra Club, nuclear power, wind, solar, and so my takeaway from that was, when you have enough of those stakeholders, when you have enough of those groups all on the same page, or pretty close to the same page, sometimes it's easier to move the needle forward than when you're by yourself. So I found that to be a fascinating takeaway when everything came together. As much as there was some pushback that Illinois was going to have to pay for this program, and how it changed the entire construct of PJM, they claim. But the fact was, there was a number of groups that came together that never came together before. And with that, I saw the power of moving the needle, and I thought that was fascinating.
Oops, sorry about that. To me, what you want to do is study the interests without questioning people's motives and see where they align and move from that. Okay, we live in a vertically integrated world, partially. Your utility is a monopoly. What folks like yourself are looking for is access, markets. My Republican friends regard themselves as pro-market. When they ask me, this group said something, it was market-based. I thought you were for markets. It's consumer choice. I thought you were for consumer choice. Understand their interests without questioning their motives and align them. And that's, to me, how you can bring allies together. And if your commission's doing it right, they want to hear from everybody. I know there's a political backdrop to all of this stuff, and I've talked some about that. But to me, a very important point is it's about the public interest. Get the public interest right, and then manage the politics after that. But when you're working that, figure out what the interests are and get them aligned, and then you can make allies.
See,
Then you build your coalition like
yeah,
that.
I want to high five Commissioner Thomas right now,
Do it.
because I'm a markets guy.
That's a pretty low five. But
Sorry, I get the high. The guy is like, it's like high fiving a power forward. Honestly, what's the weather like up there? So I'm a markets guy, which makes me as unlikable as being a moderate makes me. So for me, I feel like anything in the sub 3 to 5 year time frame, the best intentions of policy tend to muck it up. And if you can figure out a way to put a price signal on it, when you're talking 3 to 5 years out, usually a price signal and a market will deliver good results. If that's an argument that works for the executive director of the National Association of Tree Hug and Clear, some lefty sounding group, then chances are that kind of thinking, because it's technically sound, has a lot of legs. Beyond 3 to 5 years, markets don't work nearly as well in my experience, having tried to create markets. But when I'm like, oh yeah, just figure out a way to just talk markets and build markets and use markets. But what comes with that, and this was actually my point, what's hard about that is that actually creates a different role, a new role for some of these guys, some of these regulators, because they move from being 20 years ago mostly planning oriented to establish, you know, beyond 5-year kinds of architectures that deliver beyond 5-year outcomes, to being folks who are not so much economic planners and are instead referees of a well-functioning market. And that's largely what a lot of regulators are doing now, but not all of them. And there's still a lot of baggage that needs to be overcome to help folks get to a place of being able to talk about how do we use markets to drive good 3 to 5 year outcomes, and then let them evolve, let them go, let them, you know, have some faith that this thing's gonna go in the right direction. I think in Texas, they've managed to put a lot of faith in just like, we'll just put as much as possible into the hands of the market. And there's plenty of fingers that you could point out where that's gone wrong. And there's plenty of fingers you could point out where that's gone right as well. But it requires, markets require faith and trust, and those are not in ample supply right now.
I think what's interesting about policy, I would just say, is where I've seen policy come and go in Minnesota, if you will, is getting innovation off the ground. I mean, our RPS, when it was passed in 2007, people thought, wow, that's a heavy lift. Is it going to work? Is that much wind going to mess up the system? So the policy drove a lot of research and development and testing and trying. And we figured out we can forecast wind, we can integrate wind, we can balance wind. And I think what is interesting to me is what is the next suite of policies that's going to take some of these emerging innovations and advance them into where there are markets that work. I mean, in 1994, wind was not economical, one could say, when Minnesota put in the first 400 megawatts of wind. But, you know, that was a policy driver, and with time, those innovations came, the cost reductions came. And so I think what's interesting is to think about the next generation of policies that are focused on lifting up those innovations. I think a lot of them are around some of the distributed technologies, but, you know, as Ted points out, those distributed technologies have to get paid somehow, and RTOs are one way. Requiring investor-owned utilities to procure those is another way. But those outcomes can also be driven by policies, both at regulatory commissions or at the federal level too. That's just an observation.
And merging the IRP process with the markets is really, really hard and really, really important. To me, that's the action zone. How do we take our existing IRP stuff and mix that with markets in a way that's consistent?
So we're actually just a little over time, so quick question, and then we'll...
Chris McKinney, WEC Energy Group, and Commissioner Lange mentioned in her remarks community choice aggregation, which is going on in California. I've read a little bit about it in the trade press. Can't say that I understand it, but is that a concept that's likely to evolve, you know, to other states? What are the potential implications of that for your jobs and for the utility jobs, or the utility's role and the commission's role going forward?
To me, where they got that wrong isn't community choice aggregation. It's they didn't specify the stranded cost risk. We all have to manage stranded cost risk. And when folks leave, the remaining customers are still responsible for those costs. They think they didn't resolve it at all. They're not sure if the community choice aggregators are going to get a huge bill, or the captive customers that are still with the utility are going to pay. They didn't resolve that. To me, the aggregation stuff is one more option that should be out there. But you got to manage the stranded cost. The value can't be I'm escaping legacy costs. If that's the value driver, you have a problem, because who's ever on the wrong end of that isn't going to like it, and there's a legal obligation that the utilities recover those costs. So you got to manage the stranded cost risk, then I think there's opportunities there.
And I think the history of community choice aggregation is, beyond me in terms of exactly all the details. I think it was statutorily enabled, and I think progressive communities in California said, we want that, and supposedly they've been billed for their part of the legacy system, but I don't know that that is an adequate compensation. But to me, I think our own utilities in the Midwest are hearing from their cities that they do have clean energy goals, and I think our utilities are trying to work with those cities too. So rather than letting those cities leave, letting that load leave the system, how can we as regulators help enable those cities achieve their goals within the utility system? I think that's a challenge, but I think it's something we can work on.
Just want to add, in Illinois, under the FEJA bill, we have the community solar program that's never been done before. So it's both exciting and scary at the same time, because we're trying to figure out how many people get on, what happens when they move. It's something that we're just developing, and we don't have results yet at this time, but it's part of that bill, and we'll have the results in the next 10 years, but it's something to move the needle forward, and something what they're doing in California and some of the other states.
Do you join me in a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you.